The wind was a constant, unwelcome guest in Alara's life. It swept across the high desert plains of the Arizona Territory, carrying dust that coated everything in a fine, gritty film. Her face, her threadbare dress, and the meager patch of corn she fought to keep alive. Her home was little more than a dugout, a shallow cave dug into the side of a small rise, with a front wall made of stacked sod and a tattered canvas flap for a door. It was a shelter from the worst of the sun, but not from the loneliness that stretched as wide as the cerulean sky. She was scrubbing a cast-iron pot with sand when a flicker of movement at the edge of her property caught her eye. It wasn't a coyote or a jackrabbit. A boy, no older than 10, stood partially hidden behind a cluster of creosote bushes. He was Apache. That much was clear from his high cheekbones, the simple cut of his worn buckskin leggings, and the single feather tied into his dark hair. He was utterly still, watching her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms prickle. Her first instinct was a jolt of fear, a conditioned response from the fearful whispers of other settlers in the distant town. But the fear quickly dissolved as she took in the sight of him. He was thin, his shoulders sharp beneath his shirt. His gaze wasn't hostile, it was watchful, wary, and deeply hungry. It was the same look she'd seen in the eyes of a starving doe last winter. Slowly, Alara set down the pot and wiped her hands on her apron. She moved without sudden gestures, her heart a steady, heavy beat in her chest. Inside her dugout, her entire pantry consisted of half a sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, and a single, dense loaf of cornbread she had baked that morning over her small fire. It was meant to be her food for the next 2 days. Without hesitation, she ducked inside, the dim interior a brief respite from the glare. She broke the loaf in half. It was a significant sacrifice, a choice between her own comfort and the boy's immediate need. She emerged holding the piece of bread, its rough, golden texture warm in her palm. She walked toward him, stopping a respectful distance away. She didn't speak. Words felt clumsy, useless. She simply held out the bread. The boy's dark eyes darted from the bread to her face, searching for a trick, a trap. He saw none. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His small, dusty hand reached out and took the offering. He didn't snatch it, but accepted it with a quiet dignity. He retreated a few steps, never turning his back, and began to eat. He ate with a controlled desperation, tearing off small pieces as if forcing himself not to devour it all at once. When he was finished, he looked at her one last time. There was no smile, no spoken word of thanks, only a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the vast, indifferent landscape, leaving Alara alone with the wind and the knowledge that her dinner would be very small tonight. The pale light of dawn crept into the dugout, cold and unforgiving. Alara awoke not to the sun, but to the sharp, twisting pang of hunger in her belly. The emptiness was a stark, physical reminder of the half-loaf of cornbread she had given away. For a moment, a sliver of regret tried to wedge its way into her heart, but she pushed it aside. The image of the boy's desperate eyes was stronger than her own discomfort. She rose, her movements stiff from the cold, and pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The day's labor waited for no one. She began her routine, a rhythm of survival etched into her muscles. She hauled 2 heavy buckets of water from the small, hand-dug well, the effort making her arms ache. The Arizona sun was already beginning to assert its authority, chasing away the morning chill and promising a day of blistering heat. As she knelt to tend to the few hardy squash plants struggling in her small garden, her gaze, as always, swept the horizon. It was a habit born of isolation and caution, a constant, low-level vigilance. At first, it was just a shimmer of dust in the distance, a common sight. But it wasn't dissipating. It was growing, moving steadily towards her. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thud against her ribs. She straightened up, shielding her eyes with a calloused hand. It wasn't a lone rider or a stray animal. It was a group. More than a dozen figures, moving with a unified purpose across the desert floor. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled back to the dugout, her sanctuary and her potential tomb, grabbing the worn handle of a small felling axe by the door. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. Peeking over the edge of the dugout's entrance, she watched as they drew closer. The silhouettes resolved into people, their long strides and buckskin clothing unmistakable. Apache. Her blood ran cold. The stories she'd been told in the last settlement, tales of raids, of violence, of settlers disappearing without a trace, crashed through her mind. Was this the price of her kindness? Had the boy led them here to take the rest of what little she possessed? She pressed herself against the cool earth of the wall, her knuckles white on the axe handle, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The party didn't slow. They were now close enough for her to see their faces, stoic and unreadable. And then she saw him. Near the front, walking beside a tall, stern-looking man with streaks of gray in his black hair, was the boy. He met her gaze from across the distance and then pointed, not at her, but to the open, flat ground beside her hovel. They stopped about 50 yards away. The leader raised an open hand, a universal gesture of peace that did little to calm her racing heart. She watched, frozen, as the men began to unburden themselves. There were no rifles, no war lances. Instead, they laid down tools, sturdy axes, adzes for shaping wood, and long strands of sinew. They carried bundles of stripped pine poles and cured animal hides. They had not come for a fight. They had come to work. The air in the Arizona territory didn't smell of hope, not anymore. It smelled of dust, creosote, and the sharp, lonely scent of pine. Alara remembered a time when that same air had felt different, when it was thick with the promises her father, Samuel, had whispered to her and her mother. 160 acres to call our own, Mary, he'd said, his voice rough with excitement, his eyes fixed on the horizon. A real home, Alara, not one on wheels. They had journeyed from Ohio, their canvas-covered wagon a tiny, swaying vessel in a sea of unforgiving land. They'd survived the river crossings, the cracked axles, and the gnawing scarcity of the trail. When they finally staked their claim at the foot of a sun-scorched mesa, it felt like a victory. Samuel had pointed to a spot near a gentle rise. There, he declared, that's where the house will stand, with a porch facing the sunrise. But the land that promised life also dealt death with a swift, silent hand. It wasn't a bandit's bullet or a rattlesnake's bite that shattered their dream. It was a fever, one that arrived with the autumn chill. It took her mother first, leaving her frail form still in the back of the wagon they had yet to unload. Alara and her father buried her beneath a lone mesquite tree, the scraping of the shovel the only sound in a world that had gone silent. The same fever took Samuel a week later. He fought it with a stubbornness Alara had inherited, but his strength faded like the light behind the mountains. His last words were a hoarse whisper, "Don't let it be for nothing, Alara." She was 18 and utterly alone. For days, she did nothing but sit in the shadow of the wagon, the silence a crushing weight. The sensible thing was to turn back, to find the trail and seek passage with another family heading east. But her father's words echoed in the vast emptiness. Don't let it be for nothing. Leaving felt like a betrayal of their journey, their sacrifice, their dream. So she stayed. With a resolve forged in grief, she began to carve a life from the dirt. The wagon was too exposed, its canvas offering little protection from the coming winter winds. She found a dry arroyo, its earthen walls firm and high. Using the shovel and her own raw hands, she dug. She hollowed out a space in the earth, reinforcing the entrance with timber salvaged from the broken wagon bed. It wasn't the house with the porch her father had envisioned, but it was a shelter. A dugout, a place to endure. Her existence became a stark rhythm of survival. Checking her snares, tending her small, struggling garden, and rationing the last of their flour. A constant, gnawing reminder of all she had lost and the precariousness of all she had left. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Alara's dugout and the silent group of men. Her hand still rested on the rough-hewn doorframe, her knuckles white. An older man, his face a roadmap of sun-etched lines and quiet authority, stepped forward. He wasn't the tallest, but he carried an air of stillness that commanded respect. He met her gaze directly, his dark eyes holding no malice, only a profound seriousness. He lifted a hand, palm open, in a universal sign of peace. He then pointed a single finger at the young boy, Nakos, who stood slightly behind him. The boy looked at Alara, his expression unreadable but for the lack of fear. The leader then mimicked the act of breaking bread and eating, before sweeping his hand towards the eastern horizon where the sun had just risen. Finally, his gaze moved to a flat, clear patch of ground a few yards from her dugout, a spot she herself had considered for a more permanent home. He made a simple shape in the air with his hands, 4 walls and a roof. The message, delivered without a single word, was devastatingly clear. "You fed our child. We will build you a home." Alara's breath hitched. The terror that had coiled in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a wave of stunned disbelief. She gave a short, jerky nod, not trusting her voice. It was all the confirmation they needed. The leader, whom she would later learn was named Takai, turned to his men and spoke a few low, guttural words. Instantly, the group moved with a purpose that was mesmerizing to watch. There was no wasted motion, no confusion. They moved like a single organism. 2 men began clearing the chosen ground of stubborn mesquite and sharp rocks, their movements economical and effective. Others started pacing out dimensions, using a length of yucca fiber rope to ensure straight lines. They worked in a quiet rhythm, the only sounds the scrape of tools against the hard-packed earth and their soft-spoken language, a sound that just yesterday would have sent her scrambling for cover. She watched for what felt like an hour, a statue carved from fear and awe. Then, a new feeling pricked at her: shame. They were working under the climbing Arizona sun, and she was hiding. Her meager well, a source of constant, back-breaking labor for her, was her only real asset. Gathering her resolve, she grabbed her wooden bucket, her movements stiff and awkward. She walked to the well, her heart pounding, acutely aware of their eyes on her. She worked the crank, pulling up the cool, precious water, and poured it into her cleanest pot. With trembling hands, she carried it over and set it down on a flat rock near their worksite. She didn't look at any of them, just turned and scurried back to the relative safety of her dugout. A moment later, she heard the soft clink of a ladle against the pot. Peeking out, she saw Takai nod once in her direction before turning back to his work. The gesture was small, but it felt as solid as the foundation they were laying. The sun had barely crested the eastern mesas when the rhythmic thud of axes began again, a sound that had transformed from a source of terror into a strange, comforting heartbeat. Alara watched from her doorway, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. The cabin was no longer a chalk outline on the dirt. It had bones. Walls of sturdy, stripped pine logs were rising with an efficiency that still boggled her mind. The men worked in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, each seeming to know his task without a word of command from Takai. They notched the logs with deft, powerful strokes, fitting them together so precisely that barely a sly, anus of daylight passed through. She saw their expertise not just in their speed, but in their economy of motion. There were no wasted actions, no superfluous steps. They used the land itself as a resource, mixing the reddish clay with water and dry grasses to create a daub for chinking the gaps, their hands moving with the familiarity of generations. As she watched, the boy, Nakos, broke away from the group. He was not on the construction crew, but served as a runner, fetching tools or water skins. He walked directly toward her, his small face serious. Alara's heart gave a familiar, though now much weaker, flutter of apprehension. He stopped a few feet away and held out his hand. Lying in his palm was a stone, dark and smooth, polished by a river to a perfect, soft oval. It was a simple thing, of no real value, yet it was clearly an offering. Slowly, Alara extended her own hand, and he placed the cool, heavy stone into her palm. Her fingers closed around it. She looked from the stone to his eyes, which held a quiet, watchful intelligence. She gave him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The words meant more for herself than for him. He gave a single, short nod, the same gesture of acknowledgement Takai had used, before turning and trotting back to the worksite. Clutching the stone, A warmth spread through Alara's chest that had nothing to do with the rising sun. It was a gift, not a repayment, but a true gift, an answer. Her offering of bread had been answered with a shelter. Her offering of water was being answered with this small, personal connection. She knew what she had to do next. Turning back inside, she surveyed her meager supplies. A small sack of beans, some dried corn, wild onions she'd foraged, and a bit of salted pork. It wasn't much, but it would make a nourishing stew. For the rest of the morning, as the cabin walls grew higher, Alara tended her own fire, stirring the pot as the savory aroma began to drift on the breeze, a scent of home mingling with the clean smell of freshly cut pine. The dream had been born in the damp chill of a Pennsylvania spring, a vibrant picture painted with her husband Robert's words. He spoke of the Arizona territory not as a desert, but as a vast canvas of opportunity, a place where the sun baked the earth hard and a man could carve out a life with his own two hands. Alara, caught in the spell of his conviction, had packed their life into a single sturdy wagon. The journey west was a relentless grind. The gentle green hills of home dissolved into the immense, flat plains, which in turn gave way to a stark, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape of rock and sand. The sun was a tyrant in the sky, bleaching the color from everything, including their hopes. The end of the dream came as abruptly as a crack of lightning in a clear sky. It wasn't bandits or a catastrophic storm that broke them, but something far more mundane and insidious. A splintered wagon wheel and the fever that followed. They were miles from any settlement, the wagon leaning like a wounded beast. Robert, ever the optimist, had tried to fix it. But the heat, the lack of clean water, and the relentless exertion took their toll. The fever came on him fast, a fire that burned through him in 3 agonizing days. Alara did everything she could, using the last of their good water to cool his brow, but she was helpless against the sickness that consumed him. He died in her arms as the sun set, his last breath a quiet sigh that was swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. For a day, she was paralyzed by grief, the silence screaming louder than any words. But the same sun that had taken Robert rose again, demanding survival. Leaving him behind was the hardest thing she had ever done. She buried him under a pile of stones, marking the grave with a cross fashioned from the broken spokes of their wagon wheel, the very instrument of their ruin. She took what she could carry: a water skin, a small sack of flour, a half loaf of stale bread, a knife, and the worn blanket they had shared. She walked east, back the way they came, hoping to reach the last trading post they'd passed, a place that now seemed a lifetime away. After 2 days of walking, her strength failed. She collapsed in the meager shade of a rocky outcrop, the landscape shimmering around her. This was where she would die. But as dusk cooled the air, a different instinct took over, a stubborn, quiet refusal to surrender. She looked at the soft, sandy soil at the base of the rocks. With her bare hands and the knife, she began to dig. It was desperate, grueling work, but it was a purpose. She dug into the earth, creating a hollow, a primitive burrow shielded from the wind and the sun. This dugout became her world. It was a grave and a womb, the end of one life and the start of a new, terrifyingly solitary one. There, she measured her existence by mouthfuls of water and crumbs of bread, the silence her only companion. The dawn that followed the storm broke clean and sharp, washing the world in pale gold. Alara awoke not to the damp chill of her dugout, but to the scent of pine and wet earth, cocooned within the 4 sturdy walls of her new cabin. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle dripping of water from the newly laid roof. For the first time in months, she had slept through the night, a deep, restorative sleep free from the gnawing fear of the vast, indifferent wilderness. The storm had passed, and in its wake, it had left a profound sense of peace. She ran a hand along the rough-hewn wood of the wall, its solidness a comforting anchor in her tumultuous world. Stepping outside, she saw the Apache tribe gathered quietly. The tempest had not scattered them, it had solidified their shared purpose. The cabin stood proud and strong against the brightening sky, a testament to their labor. They were preparing to leave. There was no ceremony, just the quiet, efficient movements of a people attuned to the rhythms of the land. Their horses were saddled, their tools gathered. Takai stood apart, his gaze fixed on the rising sun as it crested the distant mesas, painting the clouds in hues of rose and orange. He turned as Alara approached, his weathered face unreadable but for the quiet acknowledgement in his eyes. He didn't speak, not at first. Instead, he gestured to the cabin, then to the wide expanse of the valley, and finally, his hand came to rest over his own heart before pointing to her. The meaning was as clear as the morning air. This place, this home, is now part of you. He then spoke a single word, his voice low and resonant like the rumbling of distant thunder. Gawa, he said, a home, a dwelling. Her eyes found Nako's standing near his father. The boy who had been the catalyst for it all met her gaze without shyness. In his eyes, she saw not the hungry, wary child from before, but a quiet strength that mirrored his father's. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, the same gesture he'd given after eating her bread. A circle completed. No more was needed. Alara stood in the doorway, her hand clutching the smooth river stone in her pocket as she watched them mount their horses. As silently as they had arrived, they departed, melting back into the canyons and scrubland from which they came. They left no trace, save for the solid cabin and the indelible mark they had pressed upon her soul. She was alone again, but the loneliness was gone. The crushing weight of her grief for Robert remained, a scar she would always carry, but it was no longer her entire world. It was now part of a larger story, one of survival, of unexpected kindness, and of finding a foundation in the most unlikely of places. The bread she had shared, an act born of simple empathy, had been returned to her 100-fold, not in grain or gold, but in the walls that surrounded her and the quiet strength she now felt blooming in her chest. The Arizona sun warmed her face, and for the first time, she felt it not as an adversary, but as a welcome. She was home,